Hey guys, and welcome to the first ever video by The Curious Edge. I am your host Matt, and today we're trying to find the location of the lost city of Atlantis. Let's get into it! When looking for Atlantis, a good place to start has always been Plato's description of Atlantis. Written around 400 BC, more than a few of the passages stick out as possible clues to the location of the city. First off, he describes the city as being outside the Pillars of Heracles. Now, the Pillars of Heracles are the Rock of Gibraltar, and the other one is whichever Moroccan hill you prefer, and they form the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea. It's also the exit to the Atlantic Ocean. The Greeks understood the Mediterranean was a sea, meaning Atlantis was probably not in it. Sorry, Santorini. Plato then goes on to write the city is on some islands, or small islets, as well as saying the islands are formed of sediment of the earth flowing down from the mountains, implying these are silty islands in a river delta perhaps. If you started thinking of the Nile when I said river delta, sorry but no dice. Plato says the Atlanteans held sway in the distant lands of Italy and Egypt, implying Atlantis wasn't actually in Italy or Egypt. He then goes on to say, the Atlanteans had access to the second most valuable metal in the ancient world, after gold, orichalcum. He said it was dug out of the earth in many parts of the island. He goes on to describe many different features of the city, like palaces and temples being covered in gold, silver, brass, ivory, and orichalcum. He says this a bunch of times. He really emphasized that these people were ridiculously well off. Quick side note, while academics aren't exactly sure what's an orichalcum, nearly all of them agree, from the colour and other clues, that copper and zinc are like main bits, with tin, silver and gold also being mentioned as possible ingredients. If the islands were in fact mostly silt, these metals could have washed down from metal-rich hills nearby. Speaking of hills, Atlantis seems to have been surrounded by mountains, as Plato writes. And the inhabitants of the mountains, and of the rest of the country, there was also a vast multitude having leaders, to whom they were assigned according to their dwellings and villages. Yep, that makes absolute sense to me. Yep, 100%. These tribes also had to pledge a set number of men to the city. Atlantis might not have been a nation in the modern sense, but a very powerful city, which kept the peace by holding the loyalty of all the surrounding tribes instead. This is further backed up when Plato writes that there are 9 other governments and 10 other kings, each with their own laws. So Atlantis definitely wasn't the sprawling empire some of us think it might have been. Just a very powerful and very rich city. But the clues Plato leaves us aren't just geological. He describes many animals as well, and these can be just as useful for finding the location. He describes a great number of elephants on the island, as well as horse racing and bull sacrifices. This mix of animals prevents Atlantis from being in a number of places. For example, Atlantis probably wasn't in the chilly British Isles, where it's too cold for elephants, and the fact horses have been mentioned make it unlikely that it was near the Gulf of Guinea in Africa. Beyond that, he uses the Pillars of Heracles as a reference. Like, he describes one of the islands as being in the direction of the pillars themselves. This is only useful if you're nearby. Like, you don't give someone directions to a house a mile to the east of you if you're in England and say, just head in the direction of Moscow. You can't miss it. It's ridiculous. So it's fair to assume Atlantis is still fairly close to the Pillars of Heracles. Now, looking at the modern map of Spain and Morocco, you might think no such suitable location exists. But if you look at the very same area with coastlines from 2,000 years ago, suddenly, bingo. A big, beautiful river delta appears at the mouth of the Guadalquivir River, which comes down from the extremely metal-rich mountains of southern Spain, just beyond the Pillars of Heracles. It all seems to fit. We just need an ancient civilization which fits the description of the wealthy and the exotic peoples of Atlantis. And what do we have here? Oh my god, it's beautiful. After 1.5 minutes of Googling, what have I found here today? But before we jump to any conclusions and get carried away, let's take a closer look at this possible contender. It's the city of Tartessos and the Tartessian civilization in southern Spain. Tartessos was a semi-mythical harbour city with an expansive sphere of influence in the south coast of the Iberian Peninsula. It's mentioned a ton of times by the Greeks in the Near East during the 1st millennium BC. Archaeological discoveries in the region have built up quite a picture of a widespread culture identified as Tartessian. That includes some 97 inscriptions of a Tartessian language. Now, we don't know very much about the Tartessians, but nearly every time Tartessos is mentioned in ancient sources, its vast wealth is also mentioned. For example, Euphoros, Aristophanes, and Strabo all mention Tartessos as a land which is rich in sea and terrestrial resources, and as a trade centre for silver and other metals. Strabo then goes on to write that the Tartessians were very good in engineering, and that they had a sophisticated system to regulate the river flow. He also ensures that around the river there are many wealthy and flourishing cities. He also writes they are considered the most educated of the Iberians. They have a scripture, historical chronicles, poems, and laws, in verse of which they are said are 6,000. 6,000 what, you may ask? Well, we have no clue. The document is badly damaged at this point, and the word that follows the number is illegible. Another great source, Herodotus, wrote in the 5th century BC that Tartessos was a great emporium of wealth beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and Anacreon mentioned in 530 BC of the great richness and the complex political structures of the kingdom. Other sources say that a trade mission took place every 3 years from Tyre and brought back gold, silver, ivory, and peacocks, though peacock might have been a mistranslation of slave. Besides that, this does imply elephants in the region, which is a big tick for this being the ancient city. Another quick side note, the ivory in both the Atlantean and Tartessian sources was probably from the North African elephant, or war elephant, which was much smaller and easier to tame than the African bush elephant. They were used by Hannibal when he crossed the Alps. Unfortunately, they were wiped out by the Romans in 300 BC during the Punic Wars. The apes in question might also be the Barbary macaques, the monkeys that still live around the area of the Rock of Gibraltar today. Now, when the Phoenicians first found the Tartessians in 1000 BC, they had so much silver to trade and it was worth so little, the Phoenicians actually had to recast their anchor stones out of silver so they could carry enough of it away in exchange for the olive oil they brought to trade. Soon after, they founded the Phoenician trading colony of Gades, or modern-day Cadiz, for obvious reasons. Though our friends the Greeks didn't meet Tartessos until 631 BC, after a ship bound for Egypt got blown way off course. It wasn't all bad news though, they did make it back to Greece with a small fortune, which is nice. For such an old and mysterious kingdom, one king in particular is mentioned a lot, King Argantonius, which means silver locks. He's been mentioned by Anacreon, Avienus, Strabo, Lucian, Cicero, Plinius, Valerius, Maximus, and many others, and everybody writes about his wealth, pacifism, hospitality, and generosity. Now, Argantonius, the last king of Tartessos, supposedly reigned for 80 years, which sounds like a long time until you realize he lived to 120, which is a very long time. Some academics believe Argantonius might have referred to a dynasty instead of a single person, or he could have used magic crystals to extend his life. We may never know. Argantonius had a great friendship with the Greeks, inviting them to make a settlement within his territory, and when they refused, he sent them 1,500 kilograms of silver anyway, so they could bolster the walls of Phoenicia against the Persians. Not that it helped much. Phoenicia still fell to the Persians 10 years after the death of Argantonius. The friendship between Argantonius and the Greeks must have been very uncomfortable for the Phoenicians, who weren't exactly on good terms with the Greeks. They feared their traditional monopoly with Tartessos might be threatened. Strabo refers to this fact when he wrote, "The best cities of Tartessos were inhabited by the Phoenicians." Now Argantonius invited the Greeks to do the same. Additionally, the Phoenicians had suffered the Assyrian pressure on their cities in the east, and after their capital of Tyre had been conquered by the Assyrians in 580 BC, the Phoenician city of Carthage had declared itself the capital of a new Punic state based around Carthage. Once the link with the east was cut by the Assyrians, Carthage concentrated on the trade with the west. So the trade relations between the Phoenicians and the Tartessians from 580 BC were no longer with the Phoenicians of Tyre, but with Punic Carthage, which depended heavily on Tartessos' mineral wealth. After the death of Argantonius in 550 BC, all the information about Tartessos disappears abruptly. This, coupled with the fact the capital of Tartessos has never been found, has led to a lot of speculation. How could such an important civilization disappear without leaving any traces? In 509 BC, the Carthaginian Hanno writes back after the capture of Gades, saying a western monopoly is theirs, but makes no mention of Tartessos or any other city on the west coast. Another historian writes, Tartessos disappears suddenly, probably destroyed by the Carthaginians as revenge for a Tartessian alliance with the Greeks during the Battle of Alalia on the coast of Corsica. The Turdetanians become their successors, although with a strong Carthaginian influence. But no record of any conquest of Tartessos has ever been found from a Carthaginian viewpoint, and beyond that, destroying a centre for mining that you rely on heavily just doesn't make any sense. It would be much more preferable to capture the city, rather than destroy it completely. In reality, we have no idea what happened to Tartessos, and we barely had enough Carthaginian sources to find their capital city. So, that's archaeology for you, I guess. However, regarding elsewhere in the region, another source says there may have been a collapse in population, for which no reason is known. It should be mentioned that many settlements in the Tartessos region were inexplicably abandoned around the 5th century BC, further backing up the idea that some catastrophe could have devastated the region around 500 BC. But before we move on to what might have happened to Tartessos, let's take a look at what the Bible has to say. According to several historians, the biblical city of Tarsus might have been Tartessos. Should this be correct, we find multiple mentions of it. In the Oracle against Tyre, the prophet Ezekiel 27 and 12 reports that silver, iron and lead and tin were delivered from Tarsus to Tyre and then most probably sold on to Mesopotamia. In the Book of Kings, there are mentions of ships from Tarsus which brought each 3 years gold, silver and ivory, as well as apes and peacocks to the court of King Solomon, and in Isaiah 2:12 and 16 there are mentions of ships from Tarsus. It is also mentioned the city of Tarsus was freed from the yoke of the Phoenicians when Sidon and Tyre were defeated, which plays in nicely with the existing knowledge we have of the Tartessans being very much in the grip of the Phoenician Empire at this time. Now, the skeptical among you may have identified a few problems with the narrative already, such as Plato saying this happened 9,000 years ago, not 100 odd years, and the site itself is on dry land, not in the ocean, as most people expect. But have no fear, it will all be explained in this next bit. What happened to Tartessos? When Plato first describes the fall of Atlantis, he uses some vocabulary which I think led a few people astray, and looking at a modern map of the area may have confused you as well, seeing as the site at which Tartessos, or Atlantis, is supposed to be, is now on dry land, and sinking doesn't really make any sense. So let's take a step back and look at it again. The site is directly over a fault line, but not just any fault line. This area in question is prone to the worst earthquakes Europe has to offer, with every earthquake that has been over a magnitude 8 in Europe in the past 1,000 years being just off the coast of the site. It's easy to see how a large tectonic event could have affected the city. However, most experts say the main reason the site cannot have been the location of Atlantis is that it's too far inland to be completely washed away by a tsunami. There's simply no reason for people not to return to the site and rebuild, like people always do when there's a tsunami, after the wave has passed. Well, I guess that's that. Even if a tsunami had hit the city, it wouldn't have sunk it into dry land, and it wouldn't have prevented the people from returning. Except the city was not on dry land, it was on wet, silty mud. And a strange thing happens to wet, silty mud during earthquakes: soil liquefaction. The shaking of an earthquake destabilizes the soil, increasing the space between the grains and causing it to act like a liquid. In a prolonged and large earthquake, everything made from stone and clad in metal would begin to sink into the earth. All the heavy temples and the palaces described by Plato would have been the first to go. And in this part of Europe, there's no warnings. The tectonic activity lays dormant for hundreds of years without any tremors, and it releases in one massive quake. Plato goes on to write, when afterwards sunk by an earthquake, became an impassable barrier of mud to voyagers sailing from hence to the ocean. This is not the first earthquake the people of this delta would have faced. But this time it was different. This is the first time the city had been as large as it was. The buildings would have been huge, and as they started to sink into the mud, they would have toppled. It would have caused lots of makeshift dams throughout the city. This destruction split the delta instead into 2 rivers that went directly to the ocean, no longer depositing the fertile, metal-rich silt onto islands, but instead sending it straight out to sea. This is how the Romans first described the river when they arrive a few hundred years later. Now, excavations have been carried out on the site where Tartessos is thought to have been. Archaeologist Adolf Schulten says he's found evidence for 2 former cities, dated 3000 BC and 1500 BC, on the exact same site, indicating the city may have sunk 2 times prior. However, these smaller settlements would not have majorly disrupted the delta, and the people would have been able to return and start rebuilding their paradise. They may even have accepted this as the price that came with the extreme bounties of the area. Plato seems to back this up by writing, many great deluges have taken place during the 9,000 years, for that is the number of years for which has elapsed since the time of which I am speaking. It has always been carried around in a circle, disappeared in the depths below. The consequence is that, in comparison of what was then, there are remaining in small islets only the bones of the wasted body, as they may be called, all the richer and softer parts of the soil having fallen away, and the mere skeleton of the country being left. He seems to say it's almost cyclical, where most of the city is taken below into the mud with only a few islands remaining. However, this final time, buildings were too large to sink entirely and may have dammed the delta, blocking any water from passing between the islets and forcing the water around the city, ending this ideal setup forever. After the destruction of the city, the resulting power vacuum would have forced the surrounding mountain tribes into war. However, with no major environmental or political advantages, they probably would have reverted back to the Celtic tribes similar to that in the north of the Iberian Peninsula, ending the Tartessan civilization for good. Now, we covered quite a lot there, and in case you got lost at any point along the way, here's a quick recap of the whole story. The early tribes of the southern Iberian Peninsula would have found the fertile delta of the Guadalquivir River. Plato mentions there's a hot spring on the central island and the rich silt is ideal for growing all kinds of crops and fruits, and the slow-flowing water deposits the heavy metals picked up in the mountains, leaving obvious streaks of rich metal ores in the shallow waters. This setup quickly made the inhabitants very, very rich. However, every few hundred years there was either a large wave or a large earthquake to either destroy the town or sink the town. Just as in all places where natural disasters destroy cities. If it's a good place for a city, the people flood back. Their immense wealth and prosperity meant they rarely had the need or desire for war, choosing instead to befriend and trade, which worked well. That is until, at one point, they were forced to choose between friends, unfortunately siding with the losing Greeks, and leaving themselves only unfriendly Carthaginians for neighbours. So when a natural disaster destroyed their city, the survivors had nowhere to go, leaving them to fade into the countryside, and have their lands occupied by the Carthaginians, then the Romans. Immediately after the disaster, any boats in the harbour would have seen these great monuments sink into the mud, and very possibly survived, and they would have gone east to tell the story to Egypt, to Greece and Mesopotamia, to be recorded by various sources, or it might have been passed around for a bit, a few time periods exaggerated for dramatic effect, and eventually making its way to Plato, who writes it all down for us. The end. Thanks for watching, guys. Remember to like the video if you did. If you think I got any part of this right, remember to share it with all your like-minded friends. And subscribe if you want to see future videos on topics like people worshipping planes or giant sea-draining engineering projects that could have been. And if you're into gaming, be sure to check out my other channel, Celtic Dragon Gaming, where I'm just about to start a Dark Souls playthrough. May even animate some of the more entertaining parts. Until next time, guys, goodbye.